I do believe this is the case, that everything happens exclusively in your own mind, from what you can tell. But from what I can tell, it all happens exclusively in my own mind, because it is the case, and I realize this to be the truth. What you see now, it's a YouTube video uploaded, right, on YouTube by a guy. What I see is just a phone filming myself in the intimacy of my own house, with everything familiar surrounded by me. You don't see that, right? So your experience of this is you watching just another video clip on YouTube, right? So that's what you take of it. I don't see a video at this point. I just see my real present moment just unraveling itself in this kind of ongoing constant sequence, and just, you know, whatever happens at the end of a sufficiently enough long, sufficiently long stream of such moments ends up in being what we call a video. But I want to talk about this, everything. What do I mean by everything? So how I see things is that basically our brain is simply just a very interesting computer in the end, right? And I see all processing, compute, machines, if you want, as input-output systems. So you feed something in the input of a system, then there is some processing in it, and then you have an output. And then you measure the output, and based on the measurement, then you get to fine-tune the input, which then gets processed again by the compute unit, right? And then you get the output. In our case, the compute here is our own brain, in this example. But this is like systems thinking theory, and you can find a lot of systems also in nature, right? And most systems are coming from nature. So if you think about it, what makes an experience? I've really tried to understand this as deep as I was able to, because for me, experience is at the root of everything in the end, right? Everything that you live on a day-to-day basis ultimately comes down to your experience about it. Okay, so if we are thinking from, let's say, first principles, so in terms of actual physics of experience, you realize that it all starts with some sort of an electromagnetic signal from the outside of us, right? When it comes down to perceiving on the external, and that's often light, right? And light allows us to take otherwise, unstructured information from the outside, identify what it represents, process that in our brain, and then make something out of it. Specifically, for example, if we're talking about a phone, right? I'm looking at my phone. Light allows me to see my phone as my phone, but before I interpret this object in front of me as being my phone, a lot of things happen, and the labeling of this being a phone is more or less automatic at this point. I don't have to think a lot, right? Because I'm very familiar with this. However, if I would not have seen a phone in my whole life, I would not be able to really understand what this is, right? I would define it from more rudimentary properties, and from a more basic point of view, right? I would look at it and I would be like, okay, this is some black rectangle. I don't know, I have to investigate. I need more context. I need to have more information available to me in order to make sense out of this object and label it as phone. The label of the label as such, the phone, is simply a shortcut that I'm now using to avoid thinking deeply about something, right? And this is why we find everything in our familiar environment familiar as such, because we spend at a certain time enough brain power to understand what that is in the context in which we understood it, and then now that object is familiar to us and we don't have to think about it that much, right? And that's why you tend to get bored around familiar things, because there is nothing novel there. There is nothing that excites you, there is nothing that surprises you anymore, simply because you attach a label to it, thinking that, or mistaking that thing, that object, with the label, right? But this is what the mind employs to basically avoid consuming a lot of brain power, brain cycles, on things that ultimately don't have added new value, right, in our lives. But let's go back to how the brain works and how the mind works in the end, right? So if you look at it from a systems point of view, you have input output, right? So the first input that we get when it comes down to seeing things is like optical signal hitting our eyes, right? Our sense perception, our sense organs, in this case, the eyes. So when light hits the eyes, the light itself, the electromagnetic, signal, is an input for the sense organs. So light is an input for my eyes. Then my eyes are converting this electromagnetic signal into electrical signal, right? By neurons in the retina. And this information is then the output. This is the output of the sense organs, right? So we are closer to the brain at this point, right? We have the input, we have the light, the visible light. The light hits the eyes, and we know how this works. Okay, we learn even when we are in school at basic anatomy lessons, but we don't think of the implications of that. So this light gets projected inversely on our retina, and then from that point on, it's converted in electrical signals and used as input in the brain real estate for the real processing of the raw input, right? So we have input into the eyes as optical signal, output from the eyes as electrical signal, input into the brain. So whatever gets outputted out of the eyes as sense organs gets to be presented in the brain processing, cortex and neocortex as new input in the end, right? This is new information that comes in the brain. So the brain as such is in a box, right? It receives information from the outside world. And that information is being perceived first through the sense organs, right? In this case, it was the eyes. So the brain receives the electrical information converted by the neurons in the retina of the eyes, and that information gets processed in the brain. So this input in the brain, which is like, equivalent to a computer hardware, if you want, it's the hardware, the raw compute capacity. So this processing of perceptions in terms of the actual information which resides in the field is the output of the brain processing, right? So the electrical signal gets into the brain, it's being processed, and then there is some sort of an output out of the brain hardware, right? But what is that? Well, that's the actual experience. What the brain takes as an output of, from processing the information, which happens in milliseconds, really. So for us, it's like real time. That's the thing. We don't think, okay, now my eyes are, observing light, which then gets converted and so on. But it's worth deconstructing experience like that, because you can see that there are multiple steps in between from actually seeing something on the outside to really making sense of it on the inside, in the mind, right? So what is the mind? Well, the mind, in my opinion, is still yet another system. So the input in the mind is really the result of the brain's processing. So the mind itself is basically providing an interpretation of those sensations. We have what's called internal representational systems, right, inside the brain. And the mind adds the overlay of interpretation, right? It provides some sort of a constructive narrative or unified narrative over the stimulus, right? Over what's being experienced on the outside. So the eyes are just translating the raw data, the raw input, the optical light into the brain. The brain is just processing that signal, and then the mind, as an overlay, right? As the software, if you want, as the firmware of the brain, however you want to call it, it's adding narratives, it's adding an interpretation, it's adding a judgment over what's outside. So the mind gives you as output an analysis, right? It gives you something that you can then internalize and add on top of pre-existing understanding of what you just perceived, right? It's like an overlay, if you want, on reality, right? It's like a construct that you are adding, that you are actively creating on top of what's there, objectively speaking, and you make a subjective story out of it that gives you some sort of a familiarity, so that you can interpret the outside world not as something, impossible to understand and comprehend, but rather as something that is familiar, that doesn't present a danger, that you understand, and that you can move away from, right? This is just a phone. Okay, if I labeled it as phone in terms of how I interact with it, in terms of how it serves me, in terms of how dangerous it might be for me, and I classify it as being just an ordinary object that I carry around most of my time with certain functions that serve me, then I know how to classify it, and then I don't think a lot about it anymore, right? Once I classify it, once I deconstruct its fundamentals and I see how it can serve me, then I don't think about my phone that much anymore. I just use it, and I use the kind of knowledge which doesn't require thinking. I use some sort of an embodied knowledge, right? I use second degree knowledge, not the kind of knowledge that I get after I think about stuff, but the kind of knowledge that I know and that I have embedded in my body, right? It's like a procedural kind of knowledge. And this is what we do with everything. This is really the underlying nature of our experience. Our experience is perfectly subjective, and that's the reason of the title. Everything that you experience, everything you live, right, happens only in your head, from what you can tell. But it looks so real for you that you project that reality, that inner reality, onto everything else on the outside, including to other people. And because it makes so much perfect sense to you, you cannot imagine it not making as much sense for another human being. But now that you understand how experience is being created, it's clear also to see that, no pun intended, that of course the experience cannot be the same for another human being. Why? Why? Because how you interpreted everything that you've perceived up to that point in your life is different than how I interpreted everything that I perceived up to that point in my life. Even if we had a lot of things in common, right? Even if we experienced a lot of, enough of the reality in a similar way, let's say, we are family. Yes, but there are so many different ways in which you can adjust your interpretation throughout your life, that you basically build completely different narratives on a long enough time horizon. So while we have the same kind of sense organs, we all have eyes, so we all process the physical nature of information, the optical information in the same way on the, through the neurons in the retina. And even if we all have the same kind of brain, right? Structurally speaking, it's almost identical, right? We are human beings, we share that. Even if we process in the brain the information, right, the same way, the software that runs on top of that brain, how the mind perceives that experience, that stimulus, that thing out there, how it perceives it is different for me than for you and then for anyone else out there. And what's tricky about this is that it feels like it's happening in the exact same way for everyone. And it is, but for everyone it's happening in their own unique way. And because we have this kind of commonality between us, we mistake it for being a general understanding, right, for everyone. So we are projecting our biases and our own understanding, which is ultimately unique, onto other people, and then take that as being their reality as well. And this is the biggest source of confusion and conflict ultimately, because we don't give the others, we don't create the space for the others to experience their own version of reality. And we are so attached to our own version of reality that we impose it on them. We identify with it, right? We say, this is how I am, and how I am and who I am is directly dependent on how I see things. And if you think that how I see things is not the real, truthful way, it means that you are attacking implicitly my identity. So if you don't agree with how I see things, it means that you don't agree with me. So there is the conflict ultimately, it's not in terms of opinions, but rather in terms of identities, right? Whenever you don't agree with me, I take it personal, because what you don't agree with is really an intrinsic part of myself. I identify with it. This is my thought. This is my political view. This is my understanding of the world. This is the nature of reality. This is, this is how things are. This is whatever I'm talking about here, it's purely my own understanding about how things work, that I had to develop for myself to make sense of a world which became, in my recent past, quite unbearable, right? Because I had to go through immense suffering. But when I understood that ultimately it's just, everything is simply my interpretation of it. And when I suffer a lot, I suffer simply because I am not able to understand or create for myself a deeper meaning out of what I'm experiencing. And that's not anyone's problems. Everything happens in the end for a reason if you choose to think it like that. And that's also one of the great powers of the mind, is that you can decide what to make out of anything. And that's also the power and the goal of seeing that your experience can be deconstructed to a point where you get to influence what you make out of what you perceive on the outside. And if you have that control, basically you can control your own experience. You can attach a positive, constructive interpretation of anything otherwise seemingly bad. You can interpret it in a way that serves you and serves your purpose and helps you help other people as well. And this is what I'm trying to do with these videos, to give you a different way of looking at familiar and of challenging your own biases ultimately. And it all comes down to how we create experience for ourselves. So, good luck. I hope this helps.